Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vivit COBOL Special Interest Group webinar. For today's topic, for our COBOL Special Interest Group webinar, we have COBOL's secret, how it continues to power business at 60 years old. My apologies for the late start. We had some technical difficulties, but we're fine now. My name is Jerome Rose. I am the COBOL Special Interest Group leader in Chicago. I am a business systems analyst at Infosys. I have many years of COBOL experience, mostly on the mainframe. Today I'm going to introduce to you the guest speaker for today's webinar. His name is Mr. Derek Britton. He's from Micro Focus, and he is an IT industry veteran with 30 years of experience. So today we're going to be discussing here at the end of 2019, why are we even still talking about COBOL?
And I think that's my cue, and thank you for the question, Jerome, and welcome everybody. And it is a very, very good question, isn't it? Why 60 years later, 60 years after its first utterance of the term COBOL, here we find ourselves still even considering its value, still even discussing it as an application development language. And indeed, not everyone thought it was a good idea. This next slide gives a quote from, unfortunately, we can't name the individual. It was anonymous. We could never attribute it to anybody. But it was cited as early as June 1960. It's rather unlikely that COBOL will be around by the end of this decade. So it's a great question. If you consider as far back as 1960, not everyone thought it was a great idea. What's kept it going? So on the next slide, I want to start that story by fast forwarding to 2019. And 2019, welcome to the digital era, as it's often been termed. And it's a digital economy that is impacting, of course, our daily lives as individuals, but also our professional lives in an almost unprecedented manner. And this era is driving what's called business transformation across, well, virtually all markets that I'm aware of, probably the ones that you serve today. And this transformation is frankly accelerating. And I don't know any customer that I've spoken to recently who weren't being asked to deliver more that year than the years before. And in a recent survey, Gartner found that by 2020, which by the way is only 6 weeks away, half of all CEOs expect the industry that they serve to be transformed in an almost unprecedented way. Almost half that product value that they deliver will be digitally based. And of course, and here's why we're doing it all, of course, 84% of CEOs think that this is going to help accelerate, increase profitability of their organization. So the root cause of this change is all about remaining competitive. And of course, that's therefore driving significant change, unprecedented change. But as the next slide illustrates, what is being used to drive that digital era, the change that's needed in that digital era? Well, in many cases, it's, as I would term it, a fairly colorful picture, and I'm putting it quite kindly, I think. The typical large global enterprise will be running some kind of hybrid environment, some kind of mishmash, if you like, which is a consequence of adopting multiple waves of technical investments, of innovative technology, of new advances over time, over years, potentially over decades. And of course, each individual advance offered a great opportunity to improve business efficiency and customer value. But the net result of that continued kaleidoscope of different kinds of innovations has resulted in a fairly complex environment and fundamentally, in many cases, a very inefficient technology landscape. Most organizations pursuing any kind of digital transformation have this as their backdrop and have to unravel that complexity in order to reduce the cost of ownership, but also deliver change. But most importantly of all, when you look at that picture, what that represents is tremendous value that's been created in the business applications and data that it represents. And there's a lot to be gained in digital transformation by effectively leveraging the investments that have already been made and transforming it where possible at the lowest cost and risk. And that's a very important consideration. The next slide gives you some sense of that. If you consider the value of what IT is doing, you can typically draw a fairly direct correlation between what those core business applications do that are buried in that hybrid IT environment and the most business value. There's a direct linkage between those two things. So one very strategic and sensible approach, of course, is to look at digital transformation through the lens of what's called modernization, by which I mean taking the existing value of core applications and data. And the applications I'm talking about here, that 85% of them remain strategic to organizations, according to one survey, and protect and leverage that moving forward, as opposed to ripping it out and starting again from scratch. And in fact, there's been a lot of realization, certainly over the last decade, that these kind of large scale rip and replace projects are fraught with risk and, of course, take a very, very long time to do and are typically very, very expensive. And so it's no wonder that many customers we speak to, and indeed many of the industry analysts that we speak to as well, they're seeing a shift away from this thing called rip and replace. Because what needs to be protected, after all, is the value of what's running the business today. The core value buried inside those core applications. And of course, in many cases, and to cut to the chase, these are COBOL applications. So I've mentioned industry analysts. Here's just a comment from two of the market influencers, such as Gartner and IDC, and others besides, have commented that protecting that value and modernizing it is a much smarter way forward to support digital transformation than ripping and replacing. So this surprising rationale, perhaps, of how COBOL continues to remain important is at least a sensible backdrop for why it remains on people's lips even today. And let's face it, and I don't know how many of you would agree with this statement, but let's face it, COBOL is hardly a very popular application language, is it? Or isn't it? Let's look at this next slide. This is a fairly widely regarded independent third-party organization. It's called the TOB organization, and they have an index that they publish every month. And it's all to do with the relative popularity of application development languages. They've been doing this independent study. They're basically scanning the internet to see how much traffic there is on chat rooms, job postings, blog sites, community sites regarding application development languages. And they have hundreds and hundreds of application languages they scanned for. Since records began, interestingly enough, COBOL has never drifted out of the top 30. It's never been out of the top 30 most popular languages in terms of at least conversational volume. And when you consider there's, like I say, hundreds if not thousands of application languages to choose from, that's quite something. Only 2 other languages have stayed in the top 30 since records began. And more to the point, interestingly enough, perhaps, since about 2010, 2011, this level of noise, this level of chatter around COBOL has actually grown rather than reduced, according to this index. And so, okay, front page news, probably not, but COBOL remains still very active as an application development language if you look at the stats. And it's a positive reminder for those of you who perhaps sometimes feel like you're the only COBOL person or COBOL fan in the room. You're not alone. This is going on up and down many industries on a fairly regular basis. And it's probably one of the, one of the most interesting things about COBOL is that despite any rumours to the contrary, it's as popular now as it perhaps ever was. Back to you, Jerome.
So Derek, what I was wondering is if you could tell us how has COBOL stood the test of time?
Yeah, and I think that's the very next obvious question is how has it managed to do that? Because it doesn't feel like it's a logical, sensible conclusion to draw that something that's 60 years old could have stuck it out for quite so long. After all, we can all think of things that, and especially technology, that have long since died on the vine, that were much more recent inventions than COBOL. So it's a fair question, and I think what's important is that when we looked at this, and this is the anniversary year of COBOL, so we undertook a study to find out from the market what the marketplace thought, and Micro Focus obviously has a viewpoint as well as effectively the curators of COBOL since the 1970s, long time exponents of the language, of course. But I think what's more important, what's perhaps telling, is the input that we received from a number of organizations that we spoke to along the way. So I want to cover effectively the summary of those conversations here with you today, and see how people feel about that. And it boils down to two things. On this next slide is the first of those two. COBOL has stuck it out, Jerome, to answer your question. First of all, because I think even at the time, the design of the language was absolutely first class and absolutely what the industry needed. And when we looked at that, we looked long and hard at that. And we came up with basically three main areas as to what was so good about the design. Like I say, it's not my view, it's the view that has been shared by a number of other commentators. So what is it about the original design that was so good then, to keep it at the top of this game? So there are three things we thought. It was designed to be useful, valuable, and commercially viable by being business-centric, portable, and readable. So I'm going to talk about all of those three things now. So, and for each one, I'll mention the original design attributes, what the designer set out to do. So let's look at the first one, this thing called business centricity. In the case of being built for business, you actually don't have to look very hard at COBOL at all. You don't have to look beyond the title of the language for a summary of how important business centricity was. COBOL is, the B stands for business in COBOL, of course. Now remember, when COBOL was devised in the summer and the fall of 1959, they eventually agreed the specification. The people in the room, these were not just academics or just scientists or just mathematicians. Government was in the room, commerce was in the room. People representing the industry that was going to be served by this technology, and not just by people who were building the technology, were all around the table agreeing not only what the specification of the language was going to be, but also what the purpose of the language was going to be. And it was there to support, obviously, post-war industrial growth, to automate as best possible, to streamline as best possible business practices in post-war the US and elsewhere. So in business terms, next slide, what does COBOL do that's so good? Well, it's actually quite unrivaled, it's peerless in terms of what it does for the business. First of all, it's very, very data-centric. The definition of the language, the definition of any COBOL application starts with the data that is going to be acted upon, as we all know. And the underlying supporting technology for moving data around, for managing that data, for sorting that data, for manipulating that data is built into and is the envy of other languages. And of course, COBOL's number crunching is also peerless. There are very few other languages that go to the level of complexity in supporting, the math required for complex arithmetic algorithms. And if you're doing trades, if you're moving currencies around, if you're paying bills, you need to get it right. You cannot have rounding errors. COBOL can cope in a way that big business needs it to. And of course, it's designed to run those systems as fast as possible. So it's highly performant in the way it's constructed. It is, in fact, the ideal business tool. So if that's the first of the three, let's look at the next one. And this may raise a few eyebrows to some of you, but actually, if you've been in the industry long enough, you'll remember COBOL running on all kinds of platforms in your past that either may have survived, may not have survived. But actually, one of the important aspects of the original design was that COBOL needed to be cross-compatible, regardless of the machine type. It needed to be machine independent. And actually, the age in which it was created gives us some reason, gives us some idea of why that is. Back in the day, this 1959 predates even the first IBM mainframe. And so the equipment that they were trying to compile and run COBOL on originally, well, no one could guess and be certain that that was going to be the go-forward platform of choice for commerce and for industry in the future. And of course, it really wasn't. So the proliferation of platform choices really didn't start for a couple of decades hence, but COBOL needed to work no matter where. And therefore had to be cross-compatible, cross-compilable, and have the same results. The same application had to have the same results on different machines in order for COBOL to prove that its blueprint was successful. Probably the best way to quantify that statement of portability, because it might not mean much until you see the evidence, is on the next slide. And the best way to reflect portability is to look at just a random selection of where it works. Or has worked. It turned out very quickly when I was assembling this list. It would have been far, far easier to write a list down of where it doesn't work, which is a very, very small list indeed. And it's only a commercial decision by Micro Focus that means there's anything on that list at all. In reality, the answer is COBOL works wherever you need it to, and typically before it's asked for. But if you can look at this list, as I have done with some fondness, I can remember working on some of the systems in question, some with some fondness, some with less fondness perhaps, but certainly pick your favorites. And that there is no enterprise platform that the industry relies on where COBOL is not available. So to the third of the kind of original design blueprint statements, this readability thing, and I think I'm preaching, I think, to the choir here. Better by design is all about its readability. It should use simple English or pseudo English and avoid symbolism as far as possible. Symbolism is I think a reasonable phrase to use when you can describe, well, many modern languages. Being able to decipher some of the hieroglyphics is something that only a computer scientist can still do, someone who's really trained either at college or elsewhere in that language. COBOL didn't go down that road. The whole point, once again, at the time, is that commerce and industry wanted to be able to train people who didn't already have computer skills or computer background in order to operate a computer. So yes, math seniors perhaps, but smart people for sure, but not necessarily computer scientists, not necessarily assembler experts, people that they could cross-train from other roles. And COBOL therefore had to be simple enough to understand and simple enough to code in the first place. So a display is a display, a move is a move, multiply, add, etc., etc. It's quasi pseudo English, isn't it? Many of which you can explain to a third or fourth grader very, very simply, let alone a computer science major. it's also strongly typed. It also has a structured layout. And okay, if you like that kind of thing, even the case sensitivity at the time, I think, made it more standardized, at least in its approach, and how, whether people could pick it up and actually read each other's code. Now, that's an opinion that we have. What was interesting is that readability was certainly one of the facets that that evoked a lot of response from the people that we spoke to. And this next slide just gives again a random sample of quotes from people who said, because of its readability, it has lots of downstream benefits. If it's easy to follow and therefore understand, it's therefore easy to learn, and quick to learn by comparison, even if it's not your own application code that you're reading. And that's obviously a huge benefit. If you've ever tried to decipher someone else's application in other languages, as I know many of us have, you'll know how helpful easy to follow code is, because you can be pretty sure that the documentation might not be up to date. So it's a list of quotes from various commentators on that readability issue. And if anyone disagrees with that, I'd be very interested to hear the comments and maybe some questions later on about that. But I think the readability thing is, of the three, that's the most evident. But that's our three original design blueprint attributes, Jerome.
Okay, so Derek, as far as the design goes, a good design is one thing, but that doesn't explain always how COBOL has been able to last and be so durable. I mean, no design really remains good enough for that long, or does it, would you say?
Yeah, and I agree completely. I mean, nothing's going to last that long if it stays the way it was. In other walks of life, much as many of us, hanker after an original 1960s sports car, we don't enjoy them because they are up to date and contemporary and conform to all crash safety standards and good engines and emission standards and all these other things. We like them because of the original design. The better cars, of course, at least mechanically, the more fit for purpose cars of the modern era, the ones that were manufactured this year. And so it is true for all kinds of technology. So the better over time issue comes into play more or less as soon as COBOL was originally designed. And you have to hand it to the designers. This quote comes directly from the specification again, in terms of its ability to evolve over time. The language must be open-ended and capable of accepting change and amendment, which is unbelievably sensible in terms of forward planning. But again, let's think about why that is. Well, we're talking about 1959 here, aren't we? And it predates pretty much every other technology that we use and take for granted today. So everything good in IT that you've ever used had yet to be invented. By which, what do I mean? Mainframes, Unix, databases, transaction systems, personal computers, this thing called the internet, object orientation, the cloud, containers. None of this was around when COBOL was conceived. So it was actually not just a desirable thing, but it was absolutely imperative that whatever the COBOL original, spec 1.0 was, it was going to need to change, because inevitably things were going to change around it such that it needed to play in a broader and more complex ecosystem. And those responsible made that evolution part of the specification. Again, probably some examples are best to illustrate that point. So the next slide gives some of those examples. And I'm afraid this, even this table only scratches the surface. It's a fairly staggering array, would you not agree, of continued innovation that the language has evolved and it has had to support to keep up with the changing IT world that was going on around it. So in terms of how that supply will be nurtured, the good news effectively is already here, no matter what the go forward plan might be for your organization's technical strategy. the good news is that the COBOL continues to evolve and to be invested in, such that it is going to support the latest and greatest. And you can see some of those things are listed here. COBOL's working alongside other languages such as Java, C#, as VB, as well as the old favorites like PR1 and Assembler. It's all in the box. It's all in the very latest Eclipse or Visual Studio based IDEs. And then there's the platforms, there's managed code, there's virtualization, there's new programming constructs, third-party tools. These are all now supported and integrated from COBOL. Anything you see listed here is the answer is yes, it's supported because it needs to be. And Micro Focus can be thanked for that. Of course, we play our part, but in fairness, this was always a collaborative committee-based effort. So IBM built the original COBOL compilers that were, commercially viable in the 60s. And it's widened, of course, since then. And the ANSI and the ISO standards bodies have kept the COBOL standard up to date, moving forward. And the work of a collaborative committee of vendors and organizations. So you name it, COBOL does it, is kind of the basic premise. Now, this next slide, I think for anyone who hasn't seen modern COBOL lately, and what do we mean by that? Well, just probably a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is just one of our IDEs to provide something of an example. This is a Micro Focus product. So this is our mainframe application development tool, something called Enterprise Developer. COBOL doesn't work on only a mainframe, as we already know, so you don't necessarily need all of these windows to support all of the subsystems. But as you can see here, you've got JCL and Kix because that's what the mainframe application is doing. But COBOL is working with Java. It could also be PL1. This is Eclipse. It could be Visual Studio. This is as contemporary an environment as you would use to code in any other language, and any other language would work alongside COBOL in this environment as well, if that's what your application needed it to do. So it's a 1959 idea for sure, but the technology is a 2019 incarnation. Back to you, Jerome.
Derek, I was wondering about the resources that are available. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because you've mentioned broad platform support, but I would think that there must be a preferred or recommended platform to run COBOL. What does Micro Focus recommend for that?
That's a great question. It's always been Micro Focus stated policy that for COBOL, the fundamental principles behind COBOL must be upheld, which is this whole notion of portability means effectively it's the customer's decision, it's the customer's own technical strategy, which has a habit of changing, by the way, on a regular basis, because that's the way the IT world works, that should drive Micro Focus's investment profile. So we will work wherever COBOL needs to work, and that's driven by what the customers are looking to do. And one of the things that we call out in the material that we provide to tell this story, it is that truth of being agnostic, because you have to look at COBOL as effectively the vehicle for maintaining and projecting and evolving application value. Typically, the platform is not the thing that provides the value. It really is literally part of the infrastructure that enables that value to be delivered. The application and the data is where the value is found, and so importantly, it has to sit abstracted away from wherever that platform is. So, long story short, the answer is wherever it needs to run, and there is no preferred platform, because actually it's the customer's preference that we want to adhere to. So going back to sort of the broader topic of resources, the first one I would want to draw your attention to is one of those platforms that many people and many organizations commit to run many of their COBOL applications is, of course, the IBM mainframe. It remains the default platform of choice for some of the world's largest organizations, and it's typically where they run their core business systems. And there's nothing wrong with that. So one of the first places we wanted to go to tell this COBOL 60 story is through the IBM user channel, and that's why IBM Systems Magazine, they hosted a webinar for us. We went on a couple of podcasts with them, but also we produced effectively a summary paper that explained this story to the IBM channel. But the additional resource that I really want to draw people's attention to is effectively this story told in a little bit more detail, with some of these citations available for your own reference and for your own examination, which is the white paper called A Living Legend that we pulled together with the help of a number of third-party commentators. This is effectively us mirroring back to the industry what everyone seems to believe about COBOL, its continued prevalence, its continued relevance, and in fact, as we look forward into the next decade, some of the use cases that we see COBOL serving very, very well, and some of the technology it's looking to support already. And that's a story that's been told in the form of this white paper that was published in September to coincide with the 60th anniversary of COBOL coming into being. Now, on the next slide, I think we give the URL of where you can pick that up from. Yes, we do. But not only do you get the white paper there, but in addition, the press releases and one or two other bits and pieces. But also, what we also did, we made a point of storing all of the press articles that were published around the same time that give, again, a different perspective, an independent view about how other people saw COBOL, how the trade press saw it, but also how other commentators have shared their opinions at the same time. And when you look at it, when you look at the body of evidence and you look at the outpouring of very, very positive feedback, it's clear that those who, for whom COBOL is a day job, for whom they rely on COBOL to help run their business, or indeed they just see value in it as a sensible business language. We're utterly convinced there are a lot of reasons to remain positive about COBOL, not just in 2019, but let's hope that in 10 years' time we can have another SIG anniversary session around COBOL, where we're just going to go through and talk about its value for its 70th anniversary, and I don't see why not. Which brings me on rather neatly to the next slide. I've got a funny feeling that COBOL knew this all along. I'm convinced of COBOL's future. COBOL was also convinced right from the word go. This is valid COBOL syntax. I'm reliably informed by some of our compiler people. When age of COBOL is 60, continue. I'm hearing at least one chuckle in my ears. That's good. And ordinarily I get between 0 and 1 person laugh at that joke. It's a good nerd joke. You'll all be telling it later on, I'm sure, to your friends. Of course, the quotes from earlier and many more in the white paper give us more data points that back up this view. So we're not just entrusting this to COBOL syntax. But I look forward to talking about this in another decade's time. And of course, if there are any questions at the end here, then more than happy to take them. So Jerome, back to you before I tell any more terrible jokes.
Okay. So the next question we were wondering about is who is it out there that shares your ideas? Who is agreeing with you?
Well, okay. I mean, it's hard to give a roll call for absolutely everybody that contributed to the paper. But I mean, actually, if you download the paper, you'll see all of the references and citations that we had, the space to include. But I do have a couple of slides here that just call out. I mean, well, I think you'll find it quite interesting who does share our view. And first of all, we've mentioned third-party points of view when we researched this. Well, who better than the other people responsible, I think, really for carrying the message of COBOL across the years, and since before Micro Focus came into being in 1976, they were the only true voice for COBOL that's really stood the test of time, and that's IBM. So Tom Ross is, one of the seniors in the IBM engineering team, and this is his view. We said, "What do you think about COBOL?" Of course, he's going to say very, very positive things. But honestly, the outpouring just started from there. So that's Tom's quote, a significant positive statement. But it was not just IBM, actually. If you look across the partner ecosystem, especially even on the platform side, there are other partners who also share the view. Look at this quote from our friend Bob Ellsworth at Microsoft, a significant proponent of the COBOL language, which, I mean, for some people that might seem a little bit curious, but let's be honest, where is a lot of that new Windows or Azure or .NET workload? Where's that coming from? It's typically COBOL applications that are formerly run somewhere else that are being repositioned or repurposed or replicated in a new environment that might be provided by Microsoft. The third quote that we have here is from, we have a number of software vendors that we work with who build their products using COBOL technology. This one's an organization called Advanced. They're here in the UK. Their COBOL inventory is something in the region of 120 million lines of code. And they've recently redeployed that into a cloud-based SaaS model to establish a new line of business. So Advance, again, their quote is obviously very positive. And so the list goes on. Here's another one, again from IBM, from a different part of IBM. And the next one is from a lady called Laurie Walmark, who's the author of actually a book. She's done a bunch of research on the pioneer Grace Hopper, who was largely responsible for at least conceiving many of the key attributes that went into the creation of the COBOL language, often seen as the grandmother of COBOL. I think it's a fair reflection. Another one here from Syspro, a software company. As you can see, nearly all of them have a slightly different perspective on why it's valuable, but nonetheless, the overwhelming, commentary is that they all perceive inherent and lasting future value. One here from Stephen Dickens, one of the platform champions for IBM's new Linux One architecture, and then one from another software vendor, D Software in Germany. And let me just leave you with this final quote, which I think if you stand it alongside all of the others, puts it into perspective of just how fantastically inaccurate the statement might have been. Of course, they weren't to know that at the time, but the final words, are the wrong words, the one that didn't quite work out. It's rather unlikely, I think, that if we requoted it, it's rather unlikely that COBOL will go away anytime soon. So with that, thank you everyone for your time. Back to you, Jerome.
Okay, so at this point, if anyone has any questions, if you could please type them in. While we're waiting, there is a question that I want Derek to address. That is the issue of API and container and cloud support. What can people do to see that working?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've kind of promised quite a lot that COBOL can now do, and if you've not seen that, I'm sure. Well, I hope that would be of some interest, and it's all possible today. Everything I've said about what COBOL can do, how it integrates, that's out of the box today. So there are a number of things that Micro Focus does on a regular basis to demonstrate all of that as part of its normal sort of customer engagement process. But I think bearing in mind where we are, we're at the start of the journey of the Vivit special interest group for COBOL. I think what I'd love to suggest is, if you have any particular areas that you'd like to see, whether it's demonstrations or whether it's a particular use case that you'd like us to discuss or run a session for, I think it would now be a perfect time to make those suggestions to us perhaps in the feedback form at the end of this. And I think, Jerome, and I'm sure with Microfocus's help, I'm sure we'd be delighted to then, plan some future sessions to, to maybe do a slightly deeper dive into some of those areas.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm still waiting for any audience questions.
Jerome, there's another question in there about there was a slide that talked about API and container and cloud support from COBOL. Not sure many will have seen that in action. What can people do to see that working?
I just talked to Derek about that.
I'm sorry, I read the wrong one.
Okay.
One of the slides includes a screenshot with a modern-looking COBOL interface.
Right.
Is this the latest
Derek went over that.
Okay, apologize.
He talked about that. It's okay.
And then there is one more about broad platform support. Did he address that?
Yeah, I talked about that. I presented that question to him.
Yeah, maybe just to reiterate on that one, it might have sounded like an evasive answer by me, but we have to accept that hybrid, blended IT environments, they are the norm. I don't often go to many large organizations where they have standardized, where they have consolidated all of their platforms into a single, a single supplier or a single operating system or a single way of working. And actually cloud is now making that even more diverse. It's therefore incumbent upon us, it's vital in fact, that we support all of the use cases that our customers are trying to achieve. So therefore, in our labs at any given point, we are cross certifying against dozens and dozens of platform environments, container environments, virtual environments, cloud environments. It's imperative that we provide the same level of support across as well all of the environments that our customers need, and that's our sort of effectively our mantra back to the market. That's what the market needs, and that's what we have to do.
Well, and Derek, there's another question then from one of the audience members. Is it viable then, with what you shared, to train up new developers in COBOL? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there's an inevitable question about IT skills when it comes to COBOL, because the simple fact with COBOL is that most COBOL applications, most COBOL infrastructure has comfortably outlasted any realistic prediction of its lifespan. It's going on for much longer as an application set, for good reason, because of its value. And typically the people who originally wrote those applications, they've either moved onwards or upwards or elsewhere in the organization, and are frankly, unavailable to maintain their old applications. So retraining or finding some sort of resourcing plan is very, very important for organizations that still maintain older COBOL systems. We found two things. First of all, the application technology that we have, the analysis technology and the new modern IDE technology, makes it much more viable to cross-train, for example, IT, computer science graduates, people who come out with Java or JavaScript or PHP or Perl or whatever it is. They see COBOL now as just another piece of syntax because it's using the same environment. It's no longer this kind of frightening uppercase green screen technology that comes from a different era. It's very contemporary in terms of how it looks and feels, because it's the same as everything else. So typically those emotional barriers are overcome. But secondly, what we also find is that COBOL is no longer on the syllabus of universities and college. It's been replaced by other more modern languages. Where the organization or where the employer has, I think, sufficient intake of graduates, actually what we've seen is, and we work with hundreds of colleges and universities worldwide, COBOL is getting put back on the syllabus so that people can actually train up in COBOL as an opt-in. So, make it look good on their resume so that they can actually make themselves more marketable for organizations that are still employing COBOL people. And that's happening quite widely in a number of locations, and Micro Focus provides a sort of academic program to support that. So there are a number of ways in which COBOL skills can be re-established, retrained, and certainly the concerns over this apparent skills crisis that people keep talking about. Well, I think we're through that scenario. I think we're now past that, and we're now into the pragmatically, what can we do? And actually, COBOL, like you say, if you can learn it in a few weeks and then work with a mentor, it's relatively straightforward to pick up and run with. And we see that problem goes away quite quickly with organizations we speak to.
Okay, thank you. Well, and along those lines then, another audience member has a question. Is there a visual COBOL?
Well, there is. Well, I'd like to thank the audience member for making a direct plug for one of the Micro Focus product names, because that is in fact the name of our contemporary modern day distributed COBOL application development tool. So, building in COBOL systems for Windows, Unix, and Linux and the cloud, we recommend using our Visual COBOL tool. It's the contemporary modern day IDE environment for building COBOL systems in the distributed world. So it's very similar to the IDE screenshot I showed you earlier on. It just doesn't have the mainframe elements in it because it doesn't need them. But fundamentally, it's the same look and feel. And like I say, COBOL's building COBOL applications using, I don't know, Java at the front end, or HTML, or whatever your UI is, whatever your backend is, whether it's MySQL, whether it's Oracle, whatever it might be, and these composite applications of today, they're all they can be built using the Visual COBOL tool and then be deployed wherever it needs to be, whether it's a cloud or an on-prem environment.
That's awesome. I think, Jerome, for now, that's actually the last question coming in from the audience, but you might also want to just share that those are some great topics that we can incorporate in future webinars, especially to those that are newer to the Vivit community.
Okay, so thank you for all your questions. The questions that have been asked so far will be addressed in future webinars. Anything else? Oh, these are the following upcoming events here.
Okay, and we just want to thank everyone for joining us today on the inaugural COBOL SIG webinar. We appreciate it, and there is a survey at the end here that we welcome you to provide some, comments, so that again we can work with Jerome and the product group at Micro Focus to bring you some further content. Thank you, and thanks, Derek and Jerome, for your time today.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.